Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the 300-year story of the Delhi Sultanate. You see, it wasn't just an empire. It was more like a blueprint, a masterclass in how to build power from pretty much nothing, packed with clashing dynasties, some seriously smart innovations, and, of course, some major fatal flaws. So let's deconstruct that blueprint, shall we?
Right. So, this is the big question, isn't it? The early sultans faced this massive challenge. I mean, they weren't just grabbing land. They had to build an entire system, a whole government from the ground up. So how on earth did they pull it off? Well, we're going to break down their blueprint for power, from picking a capital city to actually running the government day to day. And then we'll look at the pressures that eventually made the whole thing crumble.
Okay, first things first, you need a capital. Every empire needs a headquarters, a nerve center, right? But here's the thing about Delhi. It wasn't always the obvious choice. It wasn't born a powerhouse. Watching it go from just a regional town to the seat of a massive empire, well, that was the critical first move in the Sultanate's whole master plan.
So how did Delhi get so important? It really happened in two stages. First, you had the Tomar Rajputs. They're the ones who set up the commercial side of things. Markets, minting coins, the whole deal. Then along came the Chauhan Rajputs, who took over and really expanded its influence. So by the time the sultans showed up, Delhi wasn't some sleepy town. It was already a buzzing economic hub, the perfect launchpad for an imperial capital.
And that's the key takeaway here. The sultans were smart about this. They didn't just plop down a capital in the middle of nowhere. No, they made a really strategic choice. They took over a city that was already on a major upswing, inheriting all its wealth, its trade routes, and its clout. It was a takeover, not a startup.
All right, so they've got their capital. Now, who's actually running the show? You have to understand, the Sultanate wasn't just one long, continuous family reign. Oh no, it was this kind of chaotic succession of 5 totally different dynasties, all scrapping for control and each one leaving its own unique stamp on the empire.
So, let's look at the roadmap for this whole era. It all kicks off in the 13th century with the slave dynasty. Then you get the super aggressive Khalajis, followed by the really ambitious Tughlaqs. After them, things start to wind down a bit with the Sayyids, and then we have the final act, the Lodis. And they're the ones in charge right before the Mughals come storming in.
Yeah, just try to remember that sequence. S, K, T, S. But here's the thing you absolutely have to get. The handovers between these dynasties, they were almost never peaceful. It wasn't a nice, orderly succession. Power was usually seized through brutal conflict and all sorts of court intrigue. This was not a smooth ride.
So you might be wondering, how do we even know all this stuff? Well, what's really fascinating is that a lot of our info comes from these Persian language histories called Tawarikh. But, and this is a big but, you have to read them with a critical eye. See, they were written by learned men, courtiers and administrators who often had a pretty clear agenda. Praise the ruler, get a reward. So you got to think of them as part history and part royal fan mail, or official PR.
Okay, so we've got a capital and we've got our lineup of dynasties, but what about the nitty-gritty? How did they actually run this huge, complex empire day to day? What was the administrative machinery, the operating system that kept the whole thing from falling apart?
Well, at the very heart of their political thinking was this really elegant idea called the circle of justice. And it's basically a perfect feedback loop. Check this out. A king has to make sure his peasants are doing well, that they're prosperous. Why? Because prosperous peasants can pay their taxes. That tax money, the revenue, pays for the soldiers. The soldiers protect the kingdom and enforce the king's power, which allows him to provide justice and keep the peasants prosperous. See, it goes right back to the start. If you break any single link in that chain, the whole system just collapses.
Now, to actually get stuff done, the early sultans leaned on this really unique group of people called the Bandigan. These were specially trained slaves, often purchased just for this purpose, who were then promoted to super high-ranking military and government jobs. And you might think, slaves in charge? But there was a logic to it. Their loyalty was to the sultan and the sultan alone. They had no family connections, no powerful clans, no land of their own to worry about. They owed everything to their master, which made them incredibly reliable.
Okay, but how do you pay these really powerful officials without them turning on you? I mean, it's a classic problem. Well, they had a brilliant solution called the Iqta system. Think of it like a land for salary deal. Instead of cash, a top officer, an Iqtidar, was given a chunk of land. His job was to collect the revenue from that land. He'd keep some for his own pay and use the rest to maintain soldiers for the sultan.
But, and this is key, the Sultan kept them on a very short leash. These land grants weren't hereditary. The officers were moved around all the time, and state accountants would come in and check the books. It was a clever way to delegate power without losing control.
And what fueled this whole imperial engine? You guessed it, taxes. There were three main kinds. They taxed cattle, they taxed houses, but the real big one, the absolute backbone of the whole treasury, was the tax on cultivation. For the sultans, it was simple. Control the land, and you control the money.
But of course, no blueprint is perfect, right? The Sultanate's operating system was constantly being put to the test. We're talking major stress tests, from challenges bubbling up inside the court itself and from enemies knocking at the gates. And one of the first big stress tests came from within, from pure prejudice. This quote about Razia Sultan from a chronicler of the time. Wow, it just says it all. He straight up admits she was more able and qualified than all her brothers. But then he says he just wasn't happy with her rule. Why? Because he couldn't get his head around a woman being in charge.
I mean, Razia's story is just a tragic case study in this. Her own father thought she was the most capable and actually named her as his successor. But the powerful nobles at court, they just couldn't stomach the idea of being ruled by a woman. So they plotted against her, and after only 4 years on the throne, she was removed from power and killed. It's a classic case. Her competence was no match for court jealousy and just plain, deep-seated prejudice.
How rulers dealt with all this pressure? Well, that depended entirely on who was on the throne. And you can't get a better contrast than these two guys, Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad Tughlaq. On one side, you've got Khalji, the ultimate control freak. He centralized everything, directly managed revenue, and even set prices in the markets. Then on the other side, you've got Tughlaq, the great experimenter. He was always launching these huge, ambitious, high-risk projects that, sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly, putting a massive strain on the whole empire.
But the biggest external threat, the one that loomed over everything, came from the northwest. We're talking about the Mongol invasions. For decades, Mongol armies were a constant threat, launching raid after raid. This forced the sultans to keep a huge, standing army ready at all times, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly expensive. Plus, they had to build massive fortifications. All that constant military pressure, it put a huge drain on the treasury.
And in the end, it was all just too much. The combination of all that internal drama and the constant external pressure was more than the system could handle. That carefully built imperial blueprint, well, it started to come apart at the seams, and that led to a long period of decline and ultimately fragmentation.
So, what exactly caused the whole thing to crack? Well, you can think of it like a domino effect. After those really powerful Tughlaq rulers, you get a string of weaker leaders. And that weakness at the center, it was like a green light for the powerful governors out in the provinces. They saw their chance to break away and set up their own independent kingdoms. It's just like the memory hook says, when the center is weak, the provinces decide to go solo.
And this really highlights a fundamental truth about the Sultanate. Even when it was at its absolute peak, its control was never total. It was never 100%. The farther you got from Delhi, the shakier its authority got. Those really distant provinces or places with tough terrain like dense forests, they were always a headache to govern, and a lot of the time, they basically did their own thing anyway.
So, here's the final takeaway. The Delhi Sultanate has one big, unified empire. Yeah, it eventually fell apart, but its legacy was huge. All those systems they created, the administration, the tax collection, the military organization, they didn't just vanish. They left behind a ready-made blueprint for how to run an empire in India, a blueprint that was just sitting there, waiting to be picked up, tweaked and used by the next great power to hit the scene, the Mughals.